The rain poured heavily as Daniel stood alone at the edge of the bridge, staring at the city lights flickering in the distance. His hands clenched into fists, his mind clouded with doubt. For years, he had relied on others, friends, family, even strangers, to guide him, to tell him what to do, who to be. But where had that left him? Lost, empty, wondering if he had ever truly known himself. Just hours ago, everything had seemed fine. He had walked into his job interview with confidence, expecting his friend's recommendation to secure him the position. But when the hiring manager asked, "Tell me about yourself," his mind went blank. He had spent so much time trying to fit into the expectations of others that he no longer knew what made him him. The rejection was swift, and as he walked out of the office, a painful realization struck him. No one was coming to save him. Frustration swirled inside him as he wandered through the rain, each drop feeling like a reminder of his failures. He had spent his whole life waiting for someone else's approval, someone else's guidance. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe it was time to believe in himself. But how? Where do you even begin when you've spent your entire life relying on others? A sudden gust of wind sent a chill through his body, snapping him back to the present. He exhaled, wiping the rain from his face, and took a deep breath. Maybe the answer wasn't in the past. Maybe it wasn't in what others thought of him. Maybe it was in the next step he chose to take, right here, right now. And then, just as the weight of self-doubt threatened to pull him down again, his phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. 5 simple words that made his heart race. "It's time. Meet me now." His pulse quickened. Who was this? How did they know what he was going through? And most importantly, was this the moment that would change everything? What Daniel didn't realize was that this night, this storm, and this one decision would be the turning point of his life. Because sometimes, believing in yourself begins with a single leap into the unknown. Daniel stared at the message, his fingers tightening around the phone. The rain still poured, the city around him buzzing with the hum of passing cars and distant voices. He glanced around as if expecting someone to be watching him, but the streets were just as empty as they had been a moment ago. Who had sent this? And why did it feel like they were speaking directly to the doubt that had been eating away at him all night? A part of him wanted to ignore it, toss the phone in his pocket, and go home. But another part, the part that was tired of feeling stuck, tired of waiting for something to change, felt a strange pull. His heart pounded as he typed back a simple response. "Who is this?" No reply. The screen stayed dark. His breath came out in a slow, shaky exhale. Maybe it was nothing, a wrong number, a prank, or maybe, just maybe, this was the sign he had been waiting for. He looked back at the city, at the glowing windows of offices filled with people who had it all figured out, or at least that's how it seemed from the outside. He had spent his whole life watching people move forward while he stood still, waiting for permission to start. Maybe this message wasn't an accident. After a long moment, he took a deep breath and typed again. "Where?" This time, the response came immediately. An address. His stomach twisted. He knew that place. It wasn't far, just a few blocks from where he stood. An old bookstore tucked between 2 towering buildings, a place most people passed without a second glance. He hadn't been there in years. Not since... He shook his head. That part of his life felt like another world. A version of himself he barely recognized. His fingers hovered over the phone, uncertainty creeping in again. Was he really about to do this? Was he about to walk into something he didn't understand just because of some cryptic message? A car sped by, splashing water onto the sidewalk, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked down at his soaked shoes and let out a small, almost bitter laugh. He was already standing in the rain, already lost. What did he really have to lose? Without thinking any further, he turned and started walking toward the bookstore, the unknown pulling him forward with every step. Daniel's footsteps echoed against the wet pavement as he neared the bookstore. The neon sign above the door flickered weakly, casting a dim glow on the rain-slicked sidewalk. He hesitated, his breath shallow. What was he walking into? His instincts told him to turn back, but something deeper, something restless, pushed him forward. The door creaked as he stepped inside. The scent of old paper and ink filled the air, wrapping around him like a forgotten memory. Shelves towered on either side, packed with books whose spines whispered of knowledge and secrets. The place was empty, or so it seemed. Then a voice emerged from the shadows. "You finally showed up!" Daniel's heart jolted. He turned sharply, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. A figure stood near the back, partially hidden behind a stack of books. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the tension creeping up his spine. The figure stepped forward, revealing sharp eyes that studied him carefully. "The real question is, do you know who you are?" Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer, and that terrified him more than anything. Daniel's throat felt dry as he held the stranger's gaze. The dim light from a nearby lamp barely illuminated the man's face, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about him. His presence carried a weight, like he had been expecting Daniel long before this moment. "I don't understand," Daniel muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Why am I here? Who sent me that message?" The man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "You already know the answer. You just don't want to face it." A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. He didn't know what that meant, but something about it made his chest tighten. His mind raced through memories. Old conversations, lost friendships, moments when he had felt powerless, waiting for someone else to decide his future. Was that what this was about? The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. He placed it on the table between them and slid it toward Daniel. "This," he said, "was meant for you. But only if you're ready." Daniel stared at the envelope, his heart pounding. His fingers twitched at his sides. What could be inside? A name? A message? A truth he wasn't prepared to face? His pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly reached for it. But just as his fingertips brushed the paper, the bookstore door swung open with a bang. A rush of cold air flooded in, and with it, a second voice. Sharp, urgent. "Daniel, stop!" He whipped around, his pulse spiking. A woman stood in the doorway, her eyes locked on him with something between fear and desperation. "You don't know what you're about to do," she said breathlessly. "And once you do, there's no turning back." Daniel froze, his hand hovering over the envelope. The woman's voice sent a sharp jolt through him, cutting through the thick air of mystery that had surrounded him since he stepped inside. He turned to face her, confusion and unease twisting inside him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman took a hesitant step forward, her soaked jacket dripping onto the wooden floor. Her eyes darted between him and the man, her expression tense. "I'm someone who knows what happens if you open that," she said, "and I'm telling you, you don't want to." Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He looked back at the man, who remained still, watching the exchange with an eerie calm. The envelope sat untouched on the table, carrying an invisible weight. "She's trying to stop you," the man said smoothly, folding his arms. "Because once you read what's inside, you won't need people like her anymore." Daniel's stomach twisted. What was that supposed to mean? He turned to the woman, searching her face for answers. "That's not true," she snapped, stepping closer. "I'm trying to help you before it's too late, before you make a mistake you can't undo." His breath came faster now. Everything was unraveling too fast, the tension between the two strangers pulling him in opposite directions. "Daniel," the man said, his voice steady. "No more waiting, no more doubt. You wanted answers? Take them." The woman's hands clenched into fists. "Think, Daniel. Why now? Why you?" She hesitated, then spoke softer. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You never did. Daniel swallowed hard, torn between two impossible choices. And as his fingers inched toward the envelope once more, he realized whatever happened next would change everything. Daniel's fingers hovered over the envelope, his breath unsteady. The weight of both their eyes pressed down on him. The man's voice had been firm, certain, like he had all the answers Daniel had been searching for. But the woman's words stirred something deeper, something raw. His whole life, he had waited for guidance, waited for approval, waited for someone else to tell him what path to take. And now, standing here, trapped between two people who seemed to know more about his fate than he did, he realized he was still waiting, his jaw clenched, no more. With a sudden movement, he grabbed the envelope and tore it open. His hands shook as he pulled out a single folded page. His eyes scanned the words, his heart pounding. And then he stopped breathing. The paper wasn't from a stranger. It wasn't some cryptic message or a secret meant to guide him. It was his own writing, a letter dated years ago, a letter he had written to himself. His pulse roared in his ears. The words were rushed, desperate, scrawled in his own uneven handwriting. If you're reading this, it means you're lost again. But listen to me. No one is coming to save you. You have to choose for yourself. Stop looking for the answers in other people. Trust yourself. That's the only way forward. Daniel's grip tightened on the paper. He looked up, his mind spinning. The man's expression was unreadable. The woman let out a slow breath, as if she had known all along. Everything around him blurred as the truth hit him. This wasn't about the letter. It was never about the people standing in front of him. The real battle had always been inside him. And for the first time, he knew exactly what he had to do. Daniel stood frozen, the letter trembling in his grip. The words felt like an echo from a past self, one he had forgotten, buried beneath years of doubt. He had written this? Had he really known, even back then, that the only way forward was to trust himself? Slowly, he looked up. The man across the table watched him in silence, his expression unreadable. The woman, still standing by the door, let out a small sigh of relief. It was as if she had been waiting for him to realize the truth on his own. Daniel swallowed hard. This was never about them, he muttered under his breath. It was about me. The man gave a small nod, almost approving. And now you see. A strange calm settled over Daniel. The confusion, the fear, the endless searching for validation, it all seemed so distant now. He had spent so long believing he needed someone else to tell him who he was, what to do, what path to take. But the answer had been inside him all along. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his pocket. Then, without hesitation, he turned away from the table and walked toward the door. The woman stepped aside, her expression softer now. "You made the right choice," she said quietly. Daniel didn't reply right away. He just met her gaze, nodded once, and then stepped out into the night. The rain had stopped. The air was still, fresh, carrying a quiet sense of renewal. He looked up at the city lights, the same ones he had stared at earlier that night. But they felt different now, brighter, clearer. He reached into his pocket, gripping the letter one last time before letting it go. The past had served its purpose. It had led him here. But now it was time to move forward, not because someone told him to, not because he was waiting for permission, but because he finally believed in himself. With a deep breath, Daniel took his first step, not toward an answer, not toward another person's expectation, but toward himself. And this time, he wasn't afraid.